Welcome to episode 5 of the Ghost Furnace podcast. Today, you will hear an interview about one person's experience staying in a seemingly haunted house, as well as several stories involving a strange creature lurking around a cemetery in West Virginia. If you have a paranormal experience of your own that you would like to share, please email it to us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, please rate, subscribe, and review on whichever platform you use. Also, like and share us on Instagram and Facebook. The hosts of the Ghost Furnace podcast are Nick Pennsylvania, Bond, sometimes referred to as Brendan, and Mike. Thank you and enjoy the show.
So everyone, tonight, one of the interviews that I have for you all is one that I did with my buddy Eric. And now me and Eric used to work together and spend a lot of time together and never really talked about paranormal stuff. But whenever we launched this podcast, he reached out and said that he had a story. And I was really excited to hear it because Eric is a wonderful guy and an excellent storyteller to begin with. So whenever he said he had some kind of a ghost-related story, I was super excited. And we had a really awesome conversation, and that's what we're going to play for you guys now. So here you go.
Thank you so much for talking to us tonight, Eric.
My pleasure, Brendan. My pleasure.
Awesome. So go ahead and just tell us what happened.
This was actually 1998. I was in college. It was one of my first years of college. And I had moved into this house that had it already had 4 people living in it. The house itself was, I'm told, and I cannot confirm, just because of the time frame, that it was a funeral home at one point in time. At this point in time, this is in Morgantown, the WVU. The address of the house was 57 Beechhurst. Damn shame that it's a parking lot now. They actually mowed it over. And anyway, so I had moved into this house with 4 roommates, and I had the attic bedroom. It was a big old kind of Victorian house that had real wide stairways. The stairways that went up had a 90-degree lift that went up to the 3 bedrooms on the second floor. And then from the second floor to the attic bedroom where I lived, there was a set of steps that went kind of up toward the side of the house. There's like 7 steps and then a 180-degree landing and another 7 steps that came up to the doorway, which was the attic bedroom, which was where I stayed. I had heard when I moved into the house, my roommates were, I considered, assumed that they were joking that, oh, the house is haunted or what have you, keep an eye out. Yeah. And, it didn't really take. Sure. Whatever. So I was there for a month or 2, and my roommates, I got to be pretty good friends with my roommates. And I came home from work or class, I forget which. It was in the afternoon, it was daytime, and they had all gone out. Like all 4 of them had left the house, and I was supposed to meet up with them. And I said, I'm going to grab a shower, and I'll meet you out. So I had to go downstairs to get a shower to the second floor, and I went back up after my shower. Now, after you go up the stairs, the 180-degree, landing to go up the steps to the room. As you walk into the attic bedroom, to the left, they had walled off like a closet, like a walk-in closet. So it was immediately to the left of the doorway. So I was in there, I was getting dressed. I didn't even have my shirt on at the time. And I heard 3 distinct footsteps coming up the steps. And I was like, yo, and I leaned back so I could see out the door to see who was coming in my bedroom, and nobody walked in. I was like, that's, weird. Nobody's here. And I, threw my shirt on and I stepped out and I looked down the stairway, nobody there. And I went down, all the way downstairs and checked. I'm like, nobody's in the house. And it was 3 distinct steps. And since I agreed to talk with you about this, I've been thinking about this a good bit. And it always just occurred to me that the steps were coming up the stairs into the attic bedroom. And I've been thinking about this, and the footfalls of going up steps sounds different than going down steps.
Yes.
But I got the distinct impression that the footsteps were coming up the stairs into the bedroom. That happened the one time, and I had heard other footsteps at other times, but thought, it was somebody else in the house or something along those lines. Yeah. So after that, there was another instance, which I should probably go chronologically here, that after this had happened, these girls that I lived with, some evening, they brought some dude home from the bar who claimed he was psychic. He actually, when he came into the house, he said, when he walked up onto the porch, he was like, "Oh my," just you could tell that he was a little freaked out by it. He had some kind of protective necklace on that he took off before he came into the house, and he walked through the entire house and all the way up into the attic bedroom. And this guy, had stated, he's like, "Well, I definitely can see that there's two entities, spirits," I forget the term that he used, in his house. He said, "One's a little girl, about 8 years old." He said, "So if you're seeing anything that's mischievous or anything around here, that's probably her." He said, "But up here in the attic bedroom," he said, "there's an older gentleman. He just likes to hang out up here and read books," is kind of what he said. So, and that kind of, made sense. The footsteps, they didn't sound like running footsteps. It was just dun, three footsteps.
Yeah.
So during this time, I was a smoker at the time, and I had a Zippo lighter, which was, it was almost talismanic to me. I carried it everywhere with me. It was my lucky charm and what have you. And I was in my bedroom one day, and I just noticed that it disappeared. And this lighter, I tore the house apart. I tore my bedroom up there apart. I tore my house apart. For weeks, this thing was gone. I could not find this lighter. And it finally got to the point that I stopped bitching about it. I was just complaining to everybody. I wish I could find my damn lighter,
Yeah.
And, probably weeks after that, I'm sitting in my bedroom and I'm studying, and I look over to my desk, and that lighter is sitting, it's laying in between books that I had stacked up on my desk. There was 3 or 4 books, and I noticed a space, and that lighter was in between them. Well, I had used those books every week, going to class between those 2 points in time.
Okay.
And that occurred to me after the fact. I'm like, that's probably that little girl screwing around, if that wasn't the case. I have no reason to believe that it was my roommates screwing with me. They had, they didn't have any reason to do anything along those lines. And I kind of, kept that one to myself once I found it. I didn't say anything just to see what would happen. That's the last I had heard of it. So those were, and I had, so when I said I was going to talk to you about it, I reached out to my old roommates, whom I'm still friends with, a couple of them. Yeah, and asked them about it. None of them stayed in the attic bedroom. And they were telling me that, I've never had any experiences there, but, other people that have lived there have, and had brought up the one girl they said that lived in that bedroom, brought up, a tall gentleman that wore a hat and carried a briefcase.
Really?
And also said that she had some sleep paralysis in there as well. She described it. What they said to me was this is secondhand, granted.
Yeah.
That is, she described it as being held down. So this, it's a shame now that the house is gone, actually. Which leads me, I want to ask you a question. What happens? What do you think happens with these spirits when they mow down a house?
Well, that's a hell of a question. I think whenever you talk about spirits, there are, generally speaking, two main categories that things kind of fall into. Well, I'd actually say 3 categories, but the 2 main ones I'd say are residual entities and intelligent entities. Residual, classically are looked at as almost a replaying of energy, which is what like the footsteps would be. Then you have intelligent, which is more interactive. It also, the lighter moving seems intelligent because, like you said, it almost seems like mischievous.
Yes.
So I think that the first type, I think that when it comes to intelligent hauntings, they're more tied to a general area and can kind of move around. Because you hear that a lot with stories where people run into entities and through research find out that it's someone who died or buried or lived sometimes miles away. Whereas with residual hauntings, it seems to be very localized. So I would say in this case, it really depends on what you think. I would say that if it was intelligent, it probably moved somewhere else or dissipated. Or if it was residual, more than likely it dissipated along with the house. What do you think?
Well, I see it's a parking lot now, and I'm not here about anybody being freaked out by seeing shadow figures and alongside their car when they back out or anything. So this is not something I'm well versed in. So
yeah, no, it's really interesting though. Like when you talked about first, let's go with the first thing that happened with the footsteps and everything. I think it's interesting that because I think our first reaction typically the most accurate when it comes to things like this. Like when you thought it was someone coming up the steps, I think you're right that there is a big difference between the sound the ball of someone's foot makes as they're walking up steps versus heels hitting as they're going down.
Yeah.
Then when it comes to the lighter moving, that's really interesting. When it comes to that is more along the lines of what people typically associate with like trickster spirits or like poltergeist activity, is typically something trying to get someone's attention. So in the fact that, like you said, the lighter was somewhere where, besides the fact that you're tearing your whole apartment apart,
I tore it apart.
Besides that, it ended up somewhere where you would have seen it just even in your day-to-day routines, and that seems so much more purposeful than just misplacing it. Like if you said, "Oh, I lost my lighter," and then it turned up in the dryer, it's like, well,
Right.
it probably was, kind of thing. It's it's interesting that the place had a reputation whenever you moved in, even though your friends said that at least they personally didn't have any experiences in there. It makes you wonder what kind of things happened in the house almost.
I'm not sure how long it was set up as apartments. I'm sure it was many, many years. So I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there, but I mean, how would you find who lived in a college apartment building from 1977 until 2000, Yeah.
Did you have any experiences prior?
That was my first experience. Since I've had a few strange things happen, not in that household though. So, I mean, one thing in particular was I actually live in my grandparents' house. When they passed away, I took over the house. Okay. And my grandfather was, to put it nicely, he wasn't the nicest guy a lot of times.
Yeah.
And he was very set in his ways. He was very stubborn. And one thing that I did was he always had on top of the refrigerator in the kitchen, he always had a radio. And he always listened to the radio. He would sit in the kitchen and listen to the radio. And when I, when I moved in, started moving things around, and, once everybody got this, the stuff out that they wanted from the grandparents or so on, I kind of rearranged everything. And there were two separate occasions where I was right beside the refrigerator. There's a dishwasher. And this actually happened to me twice. And my daughter says that she's very receptive to these things. She's 14, going on 15. She's very receptive to things as well. And she says that she can feel it in his house. But I was putting away cups from the dishwasher. Right above the dishwasher, there is a cupboard which had coffee cups. And this happened on two separate occasions. That I was emptying coffee cups out of the refrigerator, and I put a coffee cup into the cupboard. And as I bent down to get more stuff out of the dishwasher, the cup fell out of the cupboard and broke right beside my head, right on the counter. Oh, wow. And one time I could assume that, I didn't put it up there well enough, or maybe it was still wet and slid off. And I was very careful after that. It happened again probably a couple months later. And at that point in time, I was like, wow. And I don't want to say my grandfather's the type to throw stuff at me, but maybe stuff at me. However, and I didn't think about the radio and so on. And my uncle, who grew up here, I told him about it. And he proceeded to tell me, he's like, "You took that radio off the refrigerator, top of the refrigerator, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "He's pissed about that." Oh, that's interesting. Somebody that knew him. And they're the only people that ever lived in this house. They built this house, and they moved in 1958 or something along those lines. Yeah. So I kind of firmly believe that was him, and just because I know the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, happening once. You're right. Let's say you take something out of the dishwasher, still has water on it. You set it on a flat surface. We've all seen cups on flat surfaces move because they're on water.
Especially upside down ones. I bartended for years, and that was
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah. So you know how it goes. So you're right. Once you could I think most folks would write it off. It happens twice, especially after circumstances like you said. And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that your interpretation of the situation was that it was your grandfather. Like how you're interpreting it, because there's no like one-to-one reason why you should think, oh, this is my grandfather. That's interesting. Now, did you put the radio back up on top of the radio?
No, screw him. No, I've talked to him. I've felt some things in this house, and I've sat here and talked to him when my daughter's not here or whatever. Yeah. And I've just asked him, leave her alone. Don't do anything to her. She doesn't deserve it. Him and I didn't get along real well in life, but that she doesn't play anything into it. So he doesn't. She's never said anything that. He's done anything that there's been anything to bother her in this house. So
well, that's good. And it is interesting though how a lot of times you hear stories about whenever people have activity like this, whether it's physical stuff happening or even like you said, just almost like the feeling in the house.
Yeah.
How having just like conversations out loud with these things can be really effective when it comes to setting boundaries. And who knows why?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was kind of hoping they didn't throw shit at me that you could debunk this. So
yeah,
I don't want to think that was the case. That he holds that kind of animosity from a different plane of existence. That damn.
Right. So that's really wild. That's really interesting. But has having some of these experiences, has it affected how you view like the world?
I've always been pretty open-minded and pretty accepting and pretty, if you will, believing of a lot of things that aren't widely understood.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's I don't want to say I take it with a grain of salt. I definitely take note of these sort of things, and I don't know how to be more open to it, if that's the thing, is that like people's psychic abilities can develop them, that sort of thing. It's, it hasn't had a negative effect on me.
Yeah. Well, because it's interesting. I've talked to some people who even something like that happening really can upend how they view the world. If there's someone who was very sure beforehand that the world wasn't as strange as some of us might think it is,
right. Yeah. It's not something that I ever look for. And I feel like if I looked for it, that I wouldn't have these, that I wouldn't see these experiences, that I wouldn't have. I feel like that, it's that peripheral vision kind of thing, that's where it's going to come in. That's
really cool. Well, hey man, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this evening.
And I appreciate you listening, man. I like other people likes to hear about this. I want them to hear about it.
Yeah.
It's not something I'm saying it definitely was this or definitely was that. It's just it happened to me, and I know what I heard. I know what happened to me. And
thank you so much for your time, Eric. And you have a good one. Take care.
Hey, you too, buddy.
Okay, everyone, so that was my conversation with my good buddy Eric. So first off, thank you again, Eric, for taking the time to speak with me and share your story on our podcast. I had a good time talking with him, like I said, and he actually told me a few other stories that didn't make it into this interview that I'm going to be talking with him in the future about, one of which is a possible cryptid sighting, which we haven't had too many of yet, so I'm really excited to have that conversation with him sometime soon. I thought he had some really fun little stories and wanted to get your guys' input on them.
He had two experiences in this house where he was staying in college, and also some validation there whenever his roommate's friend, who was a psychic, self-proclaimed psychic, came in and said that there was a small boy.
I think it said a small girl that he said was mischievous, and then an older man who was up in the attic, which is where Eric stayed.
With the two experiences that he had, both could be linked to one of those
entities. Yeah, and that was definitely a high point, I think, for me of the interview, because like you said, proclaimed psychic. I feel like if someone is at a college and is coming home with two girls and is like spooky house, I'm a psychic, sure you are, dude. But whenever the guy then proceeded to say that, hey, there's two entities here, and that lined up really well with the experiences Eric had, kind of giving both Eric some validation, which is nice, and also giving that dude who claimed to be a psychic a little bit of validation too, I think.
One of our catchphrases here in our short history thus far has been primed, right? Mm-hmm. And we're talking, Eric talks about a Victorian house. He talks about being up in the attic. These are all prime real estate. Mm-hmm. But Eric, listening to him talk, he has that thing that I think anybody who either believes in this or people like myself who just find it really fascinating, and that's he clearly has a love for history, and he has some sort of recognition of value in old things, and you can hear him kind of lamenting that it really is a shame that they tore this place down. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the one thread that definitely binds, and to hear him talk about it, it was very evident in a way that it's not always so clear in other people who are excited about these things, but it is very clear. Is just his appreciation and his I'm trying to find just the right words for it, but really just kind of the weight that he puts on the fact that he is here now in a place where other people have been.
Because again, like you said, one of the threads that we've seen popping up with especially these ghost related stories is people not seeing the ghosts or entities or whatever they are as intruders or the other necessarily. It's more of their co-inhabitants. And I think that was definitely the impression I got off of how Eric viewed these two possible entities. Like the one was being mischievous by, hiding his lighter, and the other was just going about his day, And I think that's also two good examples of what could be a residual haunting, but also a intelligent haunting. You have one that's more interactive, and the other that's kind of just that replaying of just someone walking up the steps.
And I'll say one thing off of that is if there is, for me, any reason to have a belief, it is that residual sort of thing, that replay, because we use like different minerals and whatnot in the creation of our computers and whatnot for memory. And I'm not going to pretend to be knowledgeable in any whatsoever way, but it does make me wonder about things, about electrical things, and about how much of our thoughts are electrical. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing that does make me wonder if there isn't something to it. But the intelligent things I've always been very doubtful by, because it's like I feel like I could be Eric's grandfather in the sense that I have a very strict radio listening schedule set for tomorrow because tomorrow's Sunday, and the polka program start at 10, and I listen to that from 10 to 2 while I'm doing work around the house and doing projects. And then Chris Moore is on KDK in the evening, and I've got to be listening to that for the rest of the evening while I'm throwing darts and or working out.
Yeah.
But I feel like him in that, but also in the sense that like it sounds like his grandfather was a capable person who used his force to make an impression in the world. And it just seems like to me, when I hear stories of scratches or people being pushed by a supposed intelligent haunting, man, if I were having to linger around and I were aware that I was a ghost and haunting things, I would go to the Super Bowl and I'd be slapping people on television because like I can do that. I think some of these so-called intelligent hauntings are more of remedial hauntings, if anything, because they just do not have, they've not set a high ambition for what they could get away with. And that's a shame.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and I think, but like to what you originally said there, I think that when it comes to the idea of residual versus intelligent hauntings, I think that you're right. The whole idea of the stone tape theory that goes back to quartz, limestone, all those things is interesting because it has some grounding in accepted, what I'll call accepted science. But there are so many things we don't know about just all types of, not just electricity, but all types of how energy works. There's so much we don't know that you have varying levels of plausibility, I think. And I think one of the highest levels of plausibility is the idea that energy expended in some state in relation to other matter could somehow be imprinted in some way, shape, or form. And again, as far as the actual mechanism of that, I'm not a quantum physicist. I don't claim to know the mechanism, merely drawing a correlation. And I understand correlation is not causation, but I will agree that as far as the plausibility factor, those things are only slightly removed from what we would call acceptable science today.
Eric posed a very interesting question when he asked you, Brennan, about if a house were to be demolished that was haunted, what would happen to the ghosts that were inside of it?
Yeah, what do you guys think about that?
Kind of like the opposite of what Nick was saying, operating under the theory that there are ghosts and that they are there. We hear all the time about ghosts being attached to certain objects, and all that a house really is a large object. I mean, it could just disappear, or it could just go wherever the scrap is being hauled off to.
A house is an object in the same way that we are a singular thing, but it just is a house, or just as us. A house is really a collection of objects. It's the object, because when we think of what makes a home, and we think of the things that we attach to in our real lives, we're not thinking about the studs in the walls. We're not thinking about the sewer stack that I'm having replaced this week. So I know what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, that if we talk about this imprinting thing, I could definitely see that being much in a beloved object. And it's an important thing to remember, too. Like, I have a banjo I inherited when my friend died, and a part of him is in a very physical way imprinted in that instrument, because the oils from his fingers will, to some extent, forever be in that unfinished wood of the fingerboard. And I think about that a lot. Like, a very tangible part of who he was is still in there. Is it the house? Is it the grounds? I think if it's a residual thing, and they like to rewind that part where they walked through the second floor, then you'll be walking by where a house once was, and you'll see someone walking by a couple stories in the air, as opposed to an intelligent haunt where, you gotta start trying to hitch a ride, buddy.
Also, what's funny about that, and this is completely opposite of what I just said, but I was listening recently to an episode of Jim Harold's Campfire.
I was listening to one earlier today. Yep.
Were you? Well, basically, this I just realized this as Nick was talking. The story was that a lady, she was a child, and they went through a clearing, and they saw a house that hadn't been there before, and there was a little boy.
Oh yeah. I know exactly the story you're talking about.
And then they come back later. It was just like a few little old ruined steps that were around a tree. So I mean, basically, that kind of is exactly what Eric was talking about.
Yeah.
Is that the house was there at one point and it was gone.
Yeah, and you do have stories like that involve what we would probably deem, time slips. Because like in that story in particular, not to talk about Jim Harold's podcast too much, which everyone should go listen to, The Campfire. It's great. You wouldn't say that girl saw a ghost. You would say that girl saw a boy who was very much alive in his time doing something that he was interacting with and seeing someone basically in the future. You hear stories of people just on various podcasts, especially, but I've seen it in some books too, where, someone sees something in their house that shouldn't be there, like a person or something, and then cut to 20 years later, the person has a similar experience from the opposite perspective, implying that they both saw themselves in the future and then saw themselves in the past. It was more of a time slip moment than what we would call a ghost or spirit or something. And you have to wonder how much of that, again, who knows what the mechanism is for that, but how much of that does account for some of these ghost stories like the steps.
What if a wormhole has opened up close to Earth? And what's that whole thing about, as you draw toward the event horizon, time will slow down for you, but you'll continue to, so you'll see the rest of the universe happening? Yeah,
I know on Strange Familiars, Tim Renner has said before, I'm not sure if it was his quote initially or if he was quoting someone, but saying that if you say you understand quantum physics, then you don't understand quantum physics. Like no one who actually understands it has to say that, So we're completely in the realm of speculation here. But I think you're right, Nick, that time does, even hardline science will say that time does really weird things, and we obviously don't have it figured out. Do
you think you've cleared enough so people won't start to suspect that you are actually a quantum physicist?
So I just want people to be clear that, like, yeah, we're not experts on a whole lot, but certainly not quantum physics.
Imagine that you were Eric and you heard the ghost of Nick running up the attic stairs. That would be terrifying.
Again, Eric's first reaction was not, oh, it's a spooky ghost. It was, oh, it's one of his roommates, kind of thing. And he specifically said it sounded like someone walking up the stairs, not down the stairs. This is something where I know I've talked to you guys about, and Mike, I think you were there with me one day, but hearing steps, especially at the studio in Harmony, I cannot tell you how many times, well, I probably could, maybe like half a dozen times, where I've been specifically in my little control room there working on stuff, and you hear someone running, it's definitely running, up and down the steps in the middle of the building.
That's usually how we know it's me, because I noticed Mike said it's the ghost of Nick running up.
Exactly.
I have the hardest time walking up steps. I don't know why. I can't do it.
3 steps for Nick would be 90% of the way up the stairs.
Exactly right. But it's interesting how, like, again, your first reaction typically isn't, oh, it's a ghost, the first few times I heard it, I was pretty sure no one else was in the building. But then after a few times, you go and you start checking, and you're like, no, there's definitely no one else here. The door's locked. I locked it. That's one of the best examples of what we were saying earlier as residual hauntings that I'm familiar with. That, and I'll have to have my brother and hopefully one of his old roommates from college on sometime about hearing the footsteps at their old apartment. It was just something that happened, you just sit at the studio, you hear it and you're like, oh, yeah. Who knows what it is, but it's definitely footsteps,
And once again, we have another episode of the Ghost Furnace podcast where there's glasses being pushed off of countertops.
Yeah.
The old classic.
Yeah. It's just, no, but again, I like that Eric brought up that it wasn't like wet, when he was putting them away.
But this does make me think, though, like, what was his grandfather? Just an ornery cat? It's just like why would his grandfather affect his anger in that way? Why, if he could push a glass, why couldn't he just carry the radio and put it back on the refrigerator where he liked it?
Yeah, exactly. And that goes to, I think, what we were talking about earlier, that when it comes to the mechanisms, and this is something I know me and Eric talked about, I'm not sure if it made it into the interview, but like, we don't know what, if any, rules these things need to, in theory, abide by, but that still leaves your question, Nick, as a valid question. Like, if he wanted the radio there and he could move objects, why not just move the radio back up to the top of the fridge? Who knows?
Right, and I'm not trying to be, don't misconstrue this as me being hard on Eric, being like, come on, Eric, this is nonsense. No. But I mean, like, really, what was he's like, my grandfather sometimes wasn't a really nice guy. Was his grandfather like walking by and be like, I don't like this, and just kind of like gently pushing like the tables off, stuff off the table, rather? I've seen Mike
do that to instruments, yes.
Me.
So, I mean, we know people do it. It's just
But I mean, if I have to come down on the side, I'm siding with Eric's grandfather. I feel like me and this guy could relate. I get along with old people. It's just the way it is, apparently. I mean, we dress the same, we listen to the same records. Why not?
Well, I do like that Eric didn't put the radio back,
which I thought was not how I expected him to answer the question.
I have to agree. I like that too. You have to assert yourself.
Yeah, I mean.
If you're not going to stand up to your grandfather after he's passed, when are you going to?
When are you going to? That's a good.
Also, there's, what, we hear a lot of stories like this in books and on television, and when people right the wrong and put their, this is the wrong, the radio not being on the fridge, then it all stops. And so I was happy that he didn't do it for that reason.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Nick, where you hear about people not only righting wrongs, but also like setting boundaries with spirits. Like, you hear that a lot where people say, hey, if you're having these problems, if you just forcefully but respectfully say, hey, here are the boundaries, yada, 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 they notice that activity sometimes goes down. Who knows the mechanism, but it's something worth noting that Eric didn't do that and hasn't had any real experiences since then.
It just is. The spirit was just deflated.
Maybe. I mean, everyone has their limits.
So we don't know the mechanism, but we do know that it must be the easiest thing is to push glasses.
Yeah, that is. if we have one working theory, that is it.
Oh, and changing the TV.
And changing TVs, yes.
It does make you wonder what did ghosts do before we had such appliances, or before glass was commonplace? When glass was more expensive, were they just tossing wooden goblets about?
Well, I think he had a cool way of telling stories, and I appreciated him taking the time to talk to you.
Yeah, he's a great storyteller, and like I said, I don't think it's going to be the last time you guys get to hear from him. So...
This takes me back. I was really excited because I hadn't planned it like this, but when I was listening to the interview with Eric, my ears perked up when he said Morgantown, because I've got a few quick little things I want to bring up that occurred supposedly immediately south of Morgantown. So for those of you not familiar with the region, Morgantown is very northern West Virginia, just below Pittsburgh. But before you get to that tiny sliver of West Virginia that borders Ohio and Pennsylvania, this is north central West Virginia. Immediately south of there is a town called Fairmount. Before I get into these stories, though, I need to break something to you guys that might surprise you. How do you feel about pepperoni rolls?
I love pepperoni rolls.
You love pepperoni rolls? I love that. Brendan, what's your stance?
I feel like there's something special about specifically fundraiser pepperoni rolls. Like, I don't know what it is, but if someone is raising money for a trip for like JROTC or like choir or like the swim team, and if they are selling pepperoni rolls, you buy those pepperoni rolls.
I'm not crazy on pepperoni rolls, but I share your sentiment, Brendan. I buy a minimum of 3, and I will eat them all in one day.
Yeah, exactly. I've never gone out of my way for them, but whenever they're presented, they're excellent. Yes.
What if I told you, though, that pepperoni rolls are a fairly localized phenomenon?
This is news to me.
West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and a very tiny bit of Michigan. Outside of that region, pepperoni rolls, from what I understand, just are not very common at all.
If we have any listeners that are outside of the region that Nick just mentioned, please let us know. We're going to start. I'm going to put a map up on the wall
with pepperoni roll sightings
of where we pepperoni roll sightings. We're going to see if they migrate. We're going to see if they lay along ley lines. We're going to see if
how do they follow the jet
phase
stream
correlations.
Well, the reason I bring pepperoni rolls up is that pepperoni rolls apparently are a northern Appalachian thing, and we are apparently ground zero for pepperoni rolls because it was in Fairmount, West Virginia, immediately south of Morgantown, West Virginia, where the pepperoni roll came to be in 1927 at the Country Club Bakery. An Italian immigrant invented the pepperoni roll, and it put the town on the map because, honest to goodness, the population of the town continued to grow thereafter. Now, today, Fairmount, West Virginia is around 18,000 people, which, for West Virginia and for Western Pennsylvania, too, is a pretty sizable place. Probably one of the larger towns in the area, save for Morgantown. So here's the real meat of it, though, beyond the pepperoni rolls there. This is actually comes a couple of letters. One that was collected. It wasn't a letter. It was a story that was collected by a folklorist. Both occurred in the Fairmount area. The main one, though, I want to relate, supposedly occurred in June of 1929 to this woman's father, who then relayed it. Now, this occurred in Fairmount again, June 1929. This woman's father had been working in one of the mines, coal mining in this region being extremely common. And he was coming out, had worked a long day, was pretty tired, walking home. And he sees this white animal, about dog size, but, stands about 2 feet off the ground. A head, too large for its body, white, bushy tail. And it lunges at this man. And he's fighting it off, and he's fighting it, throwing it down, and it feels like it has no mass to it. It feels like it has nothing of substance, and it's quiet. It makes no sound. And it leaps upon him again, and he again wrestles with it. It's scratching at him. He's flailing. He's throwing it off, and he keeps trying to, he's like running, and this thing's running after him and leaps on his back, and he's able to get it off. And it goes on like this. I don't know how many times it clambers up onto him and is attacking him. But he gets close to the cemetery, and it just is kind of, he throws it down, and it's kind of done. And it really upset him, according to the daughter, who, again, told this story, confided this story in 1963. So it disappeared around that cemetery, and the man, her father, never walked by that way again. He would deliberately take a much longer route home in order to avoid that path where he had encountered this white thing. Now, we know here in Western Pennsylvania, there's been tales of white wolves and things like that. Here's another quick one, and it has the same tie to this cemetery. This one doesn't have as many details, but here's the story in a nutshell. And this was collected, I believe, around 1955 or 58. The story goes, though, that this couple were in a horse and buggy, so it's going back some time, and as they would come by this cemetery outside of town, outside of Fairmount, just south of Fairmount a little bit, along the Monongahela, this white animal, very similar description, would come out, and it scared the woman so much that she would duck down inside the buggy as not to be seen. But for years, they would go by this cemetery, and every once in a while, it seems like it happened most in winter, not June, but in winter, they would see this thing, and she would hide down. And after a couple of years, the woman dies and was buried in that cemetery, and the thing wasn't seen around there again. And so this story has had some traction out in that area where people have a theory that it wanted her. And once it got her, it didn't have any reason to be there again. So really weird, because again, in this region and in other parts of West Virginia, there's tales of the white wolves, these albino wolves that are supposedly magical and whatnot. But you would never describe them as being, one, silent, as in the first story, or two, having no substance, again, as in the first story. So a couple interesting stories from a very small area just south of us in north central West Virginia. I leave it to you to discuss.
Yeah, that's really wild. You do have the archetype in both folklore and like cryptozoology of white animals, whether sometimes they are seen as harbingers of ill luck or sometimes they're seen as good luck, but they're typically seen as like physical representations of animals. Like I said, normally it would fall into the cryptozoology category if you're talking about like white Sasquatches and stuff. But we had an albino deer that lived not too far from our house when I was younger, and it was like a known thing. And you do have naturally occurring albino animals, and you're right, you do have specific stories around the greater area that we're in of specifically white wolves. So the idea that this was this was very specifically a non-corporeal spectral wolf attacking this guy, man, like I'd take a different road home too after that, because like running into a wolf is bad enough, but running into a spectral wolf is considerably worse, I would say. Yeah, that's just a really crazy story. And the fact that you have a story of a similar animal, spirit, whatever, from someone else in the same cemetery, that seems like that's a heck of a coincidence if that's all it is.
The two things that are weird to me, though, is I don't know whether that second story is significantly older than the first. They could have theoretically occurred around the same time, but I imagine the second story is a bit older. But in one, it appears at the cemetery, and in the first from 1929, it disappears around the cemetery. So it's like it's an in and outdoor.
So this thing, it was a wolf, or it appeared like a wolf? I mean, is there more to the description?
No, it's dog size, maybe a little bigger. They made it very clear it was not as big as a horse. It was pure white with teeth, with a bushy white tail, but with a head much seemingly too large for its body. That's how it's been described. I was the one that interjected with the white wolf thing just because there are similar stories of white wolves being harbingers, which that second story about the woman hiding in the buggy very much has a lot of those sort of elements to it. But no, sorry, Mike, no, it was not a wolf. I just I wonder if those stories parallel in any way.
Something I find interesting about it, and I mean, obviously, if you see something that you wouldn't expect to exist, you are going to be somewhat disturbed. But both of the people who are encountering this thing, even after the guy wrestled it and bested it, essentially, they were still disturbed by what this thing was. And I think that kind of gives some validation too, that not only he was so disturbed to the point where he didn't even go near that cemetery anymore.
Yeah, one thing I neglected to mention, I had it here in my notes here too, is that when that man got home, he checked his body and he didn't have any scratches or anything on him. So it's just a really interesting thing. Now, pepperoni rolls were invented in 1927, and this supposedly happened in June of 1929. The pepperoni rolls, this is no joke, were they were made for the popular. They were very popular for miners because they didn't need to be refrigerated, and so they were. And this guy was a miner. Could he have possibly eaten so many pepperoni rolls?
He became delusional.
And I'm joking about the pepperoni rolls, but honestly, truly, I don't know enough about mining. I know obviously there's dangerous gases and whatnot. I don't know if he could have been hallucinating.
Well, that's the thing, is I think almost like when it comes to trauma, which is what I think you could say at the very least historically, this guy had some sort of incident where it altered, like you were saying, Mike, it altered what he did, So something happened to the guy, and to him, it was some kind of spectral creature. So to him, almost it doesn't matter if he was hallucinating or if anything like that happened, because he felt so strongly about the experience. That's why I think it's so interesting that there is a corroborating story of a similar spectral creature. And like you said, historically, there is the whole white wolf motif in the area. Now, granted, whether he pulled from that or not during a hallucinatory episode, who knows? But it's definitely a creepy story. And the fact that it altered what that guy did, like I would imagine a miner in Fairmount, West Virginia at that time period would be a relatively pragmatic person on average. So I just think so something had to have happened to the guy one way or the other.
One thing that they would deal with in the mines would be lack of oxygen, which could essentially cause you to maybe hallucinate.
And I agree with both of your statements. And I mean, the oxygen thing, I didn't think of oxygen per se and the lack of it, but that's certainly a thing in mines. I didn't know if there weren't other gases that were released or whatnot that could also affect your mind. But going off of what you both have said here, I will say that one of the most surreal experiences that I definitely experienced, and it did freak me out, even though I moments later kind of realized what was going on. It, like you said, in the moment, it's not any less real for you phenomenologically. I was chronically sleep deprived for a while, but I remember one period in particular, I was really in a bad way. And I was a passenger in a car, and I remember watching long shadows creep across the road and suddenly kind of morph into stop signs that were there. And at the time I knew, like, I've been up for about 3 days. Like, I know this is in my mind. This is not a real thing that's happening. But it was very unsettling.
I mean, I've read on certain Reddit threads about people, what happens when you're sleep deprived. And I thought it was really interesting because a lot of what people were talking about was very similar to accounts that you hear of shadow people. Like, a lot of people were saying that when you're sleep deprived, and especially in your peripherals, you start seeing shadows that look like human figures that you're seeing.
I can absolutely say that is what I saw. Not only were these long shadows that crept across the road, but I swear I saw shadows of people running across the road.
And that wasn't on a paranormal thread or anything. That was strictly about people being sleep deprived.
Well, and how many average people, how many of us, it's a high number, are chronically, not to the degree that I was all those years ago, but most of us get less sleep than we ought to. And it does affect ourselves, not in just our perception of the world, but it does affect a very real part of who we are health-wise.
I know this is frustrating for people when I say this, but it's both and. If you're sleep deprived and see a shadow person, that could absolutely be what you're seeing. It could be just some sort of sleep deprived hallucination, but that doesn't mean when someone is fully awake, is fully functional, they're still not seeing actual shadow entities.
Or the same point, when you are in that state where you are sleep deprived, maybe it thins the veil where you can see these things.
Exactly. And it's probably a mixture of all that stuff plus some other stuff we don't know. But it's really interesting what you said, Nick, about the, you being able to see them almost kind of creep across the road and everything, and how whenever you're seeing that, even whenever you're telling yourself that, okay, this is just my mind playing tricks on me kind of thing. We often talk about like the co-creative element and about how perception does in a certain way affect the reality around us. There has to be that little bit in the back of your head that's like, I know this isn't real, but ... And I imagine that's what makes it scary.
Well, even not knowing what is happening to me, like, I know that's not really happening, but if I done something terrible to myself, you know,
yeah,
is my brain turning in on itself?
Yeah.
If nothing else, it shows you that it's probably a good thing to get more sleep.
Oh, I do now. Like, I'm so
yeah.
Kind of like what I was saying before about somehow thinning the veil if you are in that sleep deprived state. It's kind of similar to maybe the same state you would be in experiencing sleep paralysis.
Well, yeah, I think you could just look at being sleep deprived as another state at that point. It's some kind of altered liminal state, whether it's sleep deprived, whether you're talking about tripping on psychedelics, in some sort of shamanic state, in some sort of heightened awareness, whether it's religious or it could be anything. You and your body are in both a physical and spiritual state that it is not used to being in, and you're then having to experience the world in that way, and it's typically scary because it's so foreign.
I would say that you're onto something. You're drawing connections to things that I've considered and I've heard about, such as, we as a species intentionally seek these altered states. We seek to put our mind into compromised places because we view the world in a more surreal, you could call it spiritual, but a world that all of a sudden has less predictive capabilities. And when there aren't drugs, when there isn't wine, when there isn't the oracle at Delphi, which supposedly emitted some sort of gas, people, tribes are known to intentionally withhold from food, to starve themselves until their mind reaches that sort of state. And I'm sure there are other groups of people that have used a lack of sleep in order to get there too. And I know in enhanced interrogations, people have utilized sleep deprivation as a way of breaking people, because you are so much more pliable when you're in that compromised state. It's almost like, there's talks about that whole true serum nonsense, but it's really just they put you this drug-induced state until you're just more, you're less inhibited about what's coming out of your mouth. It doesn't make it any more truthful, but
exactly,
it's just more free flowing.
Yeah. No, I'd agree. Yeah, no, it's interesting. You have to wonder, like, if this poor guy was in one of these kind of states. Like, I can't imagine being like in a state like you were talking about, like sleep deprived or something like that, and then having to fight a spectral wolf. Like, holy hell. It has to be awful.
You know what, though? I'll say, anytime I've had to fight, fighting a spectral being, be it of any size, it's exhausting.
It is.
And after a battle like that, pepperoni roll is mighty satisfying.
There's only one thing.
Pepperoni roll, the official food of I just fought a spectral ghost.